Hi everyone, today we're going to be starting the new topic, which is changing family patterns. So this topic is going to be involving you looking at patterns in terms of marriage, divorce, cohabitation, different types of families, whether they've increased and decreased, and so on. And you're going to be thinking obviously about the reasons why with all of that. So that's the kind of thing we're going to be looking at. So the things that you need to know, as I've just said, are the changing patterns of marriage, divorce, cohabitation, separation, childbearing, and all of that kind of, and how it impacts on the life course of individuals and families and households. So these topics also have some really interesting kind of links to other areas, such as the childhood topic, because changes in marriage and divorce impact on our experience of childhood. Also impacts on demography in terms of like population size and the birth rate. There are links in there to theory as well, so each of the different theorists have different views on marriage and on divorce and things like that. Links in with social policy, which we've not yet covered, but we will be looking at family policies, and it kind of has an impact on that in terms of the ways that the government might use policy to try and encourage a particular type of family and to make changes to the family patterns that you are seeing. And it also involves thinking about gender roles, domestic labour and power relationships, because as we said, marriage, divorce, those things, they, as you've seen previously, they impact on the power relationships within families. Okay, so what I'd like you to do is, in a second, well, grab yourself a piece of paper separate to your pack and also a pen, and I'm going to get you to answer some questions. So first thing I'd like you to do, please, is list all of the types of families and households that we have in contemporary society. So nuclear family is one, single parent family is another. So think about all the different family types you know of and list them all. Leave a little bit of space around them, maybe one line in between each one. Secondly, I'd like you to draw an arrow up or down as to whether you think we have more or less of each of those family types today compared to, let's say, 100 years ago. And three, can you think of any reasons which could account for these changes? So I want you to be starting to think about if you think there's been an increase in single parent families, just briefly give me a reason why. And this will be a kind of way to start thinking about what you already know about the changes to family patterns. So pause the video and have a go at that. Okay, so the data tells us lots of information about the family patterns in the UK. And the government takes a census every 10 years, and it also does other kind of various reports in between that time, and uses all of that data and publishes it all on the website for the Office for National Statistics. So a good way to start this topic is to have a bit of an understanding of what the most up-to-date statistics tell us about family patterns and about family life. So about how many people are married, how many people have got divorced, etc., etc. So what I'd like you to do is have a look at this link, which I'll send you separately, and this has got information on all of those things. And I'd like you to make a note of at least 5 interesting facts from this report. So if you want to, you can do that on separate paper and then add it into your notes. Or if you've got some post-its, that would be a great way to do it. Write them on a post-it and stick them into this part of your pack. Okay, so pause the video, have a read of the article. Okay, up next then, I'd just like you to have a quick read of the introduction to this topic at the top of page 92. So on page 92, you have got some information about what we've just talked about really, and about what what this changing family patterns topic is all about. So stop when you get to divorce, and then that's the first topic we're going to be looking at. So divorce. You may already feel fairly confident that you understand quite a bit about divorce rates. Some of you may have already kind of guessed and had an educated guess that divorce rates have increased in the last 100 years. People are more likely to get divorced than they used to, and you might already have some ideas as well about why that might be. For example, that there's less stigma attached to it, that people have more choice nowadays, particularly for women. This has been a big thing because women now have more freedom to divorce if they want to. So you might already be thinking about all those sociological ideas, and that's brilliant. So these are the kind of three forms we're going to be considering, and it's important that you understand the difference between each one. So divorce is obviously the final legal termination of the marriage. Separation often comes before that, where a married couple will separate from each other and live in different houses to sort of almost prove that their marriage is over, and in order for the divorce proceedings to happen, and also for them to check really that that is definitely what they want. They have a period of separation before they actually do all the legal divorce stuff, which costs a lot of money. You can't obviously easily reverse it. It's quite a serious thing. So separation is like a trial of that. However, for many people, they may not actually get divorced or separated, but there might be a breakdown of their marriage. And this is known as an empty shell marriage, because you've got the shell of the marriage, like an eggshell. It looks from the outside like a marriage, but if you were to sort of break it open and see what's happening inside, it is actually empty. There's no love or intimacy happening. It's just the shell of a marriage. It's quite a sad concept, really, isn't it? So you've got some information about those on page 92, just to have a quick read over and check that you've understood them. Right then, so if you again have a look at your pack, then on page 93 you have got some graphs and some facts, a graph and some facts about the divorce trends, which are really up to date. They've come from 2020, and the graph, can't quite see the number, can't quite read it myself, but I think it goes up to 2015 or something close to that. So yes, so nice and up to date. So have a read of the, sorry, so this is the graph, so you can see it slightly better, and it's sort of coloured in and things, and you can have a bit of an idea of what's happened in terms of marriages and the amount of people getting married over time. So it's quite complicated really, because there's lots of spikes and peaks and troughs and things happening, but you can see from about 1970 in particular it has really decreased. However, if you look at the starting point in the 1900s and compare that, there's not, to this end point here, there's not a huge difference, but the point that we're interested in mostly is why it's decreased so dramatically from the 1970s. Interesting as well that you can see there's been spikes in marriages around the times of the World War. So that might have been people that wanted to make sure they get married to their partner before they go off to fight in the war. You'll notice here as well that there's an introduction of a law. Ooh, that wasn't meant to be a heart, but there we go. Introduction of a law called the Divorce Reform Act in 1969. And we're interested in that in particular because that tells us a little bit about why divorces may have increased so drastically here first of all, and then sort of continued to increase as well. So we'll be looking at the Divorce Reform Act in just a moment, but overall essentially it made divorces quite a lot easier to obtain. And if you have a look at the sort of timeline from 1900, nobody was getting divorced, and nobody until about 1940, which was after the Matrimonial Causes Act. A little bit of a spike, but still not very many. And then this Divorce Reform Act is really what made it a lot easier. However, again, worth noting, there's been a bit of a decline in divorces in more recent times. Okay, so task for you now is to, based on what I've just been saying and the other graph that you've got in your pack, is to just write a few bullet points about the trends within divorce in particular, but also marriage and remarriage as well. But main focus at the minute is on divorce. So you've obviously got to start by sort of suggesting that there has been sort of a slow decline in marriage and a slow increase in divorce. And yeah, see what you make of it, see if you can kind of decipher any other statistics or trends. And also have a read at the bottom of page 93, some important kind of stuff to be aware of, that we need to make sure we take the statistics with caution, because we don't really know all of the reasons for the divorces. We can only assume from what was going on in society at the time. We also can't necessarily make assumptions that everyone's getting divorced, because actually lots of people are still married. So make sure you have a read of that, some important stuff to consider. Okay. This is the graph as well, in case you need it to be slightly clearer to read. This one goes up to 2017, so it's a bit more recent, but obviously it does start a lot later as well. So the previous graph started in 1900 and went to 2010, but this one is from 1950 to 2017. So you can see it a bit more close up in terms of the more recent statistics. So, important thing to be aware of then is this timeline of divorce laws. So there are lots of laws over time that have impacted on the patterns of divorce, the amount of divorces. So you need to complete this timeline. You need to be aware of the key policies and their dates and changes which have added to the increase in divorce rates in contemporary society. And on the next slide, there are some notes to add for each of the laws as they have passed within your timeline. So if you want to, you can write it directly onto your pack, or if you've got post-its available, then that might be easier. Or you can draw it on separate paper, however you wish to do it, to make sure you can fit all of this information in, but keep it in your notes as well. So the Divorce Reform Act in 1969 made it much easier to get a divorce. Prior to the Divorce Reform Act, a partner would have had to have proven an offence like adultery, so being unfaithful, or violence, in order to obtain a divorce. So prior to this, you couldn't get divorced just because you've fallen out of love, for example, or just because you don't want to be with that person anymore. You had to actually prove a real offence had taken place. And obviously that can be really hard, particularly when you think about the fact that most sort of domestic violence within the home before that time had been seen as like a normal part of marriage, and it was seen as acceptable. And rape within marriage, for example, wasn't even illegal until 1992. So at this time, people who were in a violent or abusive relationship would have had a really hard time bringing it to the attention of police or lawyers or anyone who could help them get away from their partner, because it wouldn't have been taken seriously. It was seen as like a domestic issue, not something for the legal people to be sorting out. So after the 1969 Divorce Reform Act, you could now cite irretrievable breakdown, which basically essentially means no longer getting along with each other and just wanting a divorce and feeling that there's no way back. to being a happy married couple. So you didn't need to prove violence anymore or adultery. Instead, you had to prove that you were serious about not being together by separating for 2 years. But this is still much easier to obtain a divorce than it would have been prior to that. The Matrimonial and Family Proceedings Act of 1984 changed that slightly and made it even easier. Within this act, couples were allowed to divorce after only 1 year of marriage, whereas previously under the Divorce Reform Act, they would have to have been married for 3 years before they asked for a divorce. And I guess if you kind of think about that from a new right perspective, for example, that is trying to ensure that people have given the marriage a good go, given it a good try before they give up on it and decide to get divorced. So the Matrimonial and Family Proceedings Act made it easier to get a divorce after only 1 year rather than having to wait for 3 years. Okay, so then we have the Family Law Act. This is in 1996. So this is a Conservative government, and that makes sense really when you consider that they actually again made it slightly longer that couples had to be married before they could get divorced, whereas previously, as we said, it was 1 year. Also, they made it compulsory that couples would have to have marriage counselling before they can seek a divorce. So this encouraged couples to try and make things work and to try and save their marriage rather than just going straight for a divorce. So interesting that the sort of new right influenced and conservative government is trying to encourage people to stay in their traditional nuclear families and to stay married. Because if you think back to our theory work previously, the new right think that divorce would not be a good thing, and they think that the traditional nuclear family is best for society. Also, in this act, children would be asked about their wishes, so that would be in terms of custody. It doesn't mean that they'd be asked, do you want your parents to get divorced? It means that they would be asked who they would like to live with in terms of who would get custody of them. And it doesn't necessarily mean that the court would rule that they can go to that parent, but it means that the court might take it into account. So this is the first time really that legally children have been kind of seen as being able to make their own decision and have power. So it's moving away from age patriarchy. Also, I'd like you to add an extra one, that in 2011, things changed in terms of rather than going through the family law courts, issues and disputes would be sorted out through mediation with a solicitor present in a negotiation between partners. So this was to try and take the divorce proceedings out of the courtroom sort of as an immediate option and to do things slightly differently. So this is where you would be sort of more in like a meeting room with a solicitor and try and sort things out and negotiate without going to court, because going to court would be more expensive and a not very pleasant experience whereby a judge would make most of the decisions, whereas in mediation, the idea is you can come to a compromise. However, for some couples, they can't do that. They can't come to a sort of negotiated agreement, and then eventually they might go to court if necessary. And this is normally with regards to things like money and ownership of properties and things. If they can't come to an agreement about how to split their things, then the judge will do it for them. Okay, couple of things for you to think about then. In 2019, there was this new legal act, which meant that either couple can now seek a divorce without having to place any blame on their partner. So prior to this act, one of the partners would have to sort of file for divorce and cite some sort of blame onto the other partner. So this is interesting in terms of thinking about in postmodern society. This might give people a bit more sort of freedom to be able to feel that they can get divorced, even if their partner hasn't necessarily done anything wrong, just because they have decided and made the choice with that partner any longer. So have a think about that and answer these two questions. And I'm just going to have a look at your pack. Yeah, so you've got this 2019 Act written into your pack, and then you've got a question where it says, have changes in divorce made the process easier? So have a think about that, and have a think about the postmodern society and how this new policy kind of reflects our postmodern society with regards to individual choice and flexibility. It's just another way of making divorce easier for people. So, 5 explanations for the increase in divorce. We've got changes in the law, which we've just been looking at, decline in the stigma and changing attitudes to divorce, so it's no longer frowned upon as much as it would have been before. Secularisation, which links to the previous point in terms of divorce would have been really frowned upon for religious reasons. It would be seen as a sin. And that's why when people were much more influenced by religion, they would have been much less likely to get divorced. But now that they are less influenced by religion, they feel kind of freer to be able to get a divorce because it's no longer seen as a sin by as many people. Also, this is an interesting one. Some sociologists argue that we have got higher expectations of marriage now. So in the past, people would have sort of settled for their married life, whereas today they've got higher standards, and if those standards are not met, then they're more likely to get a divorce. And also, very importantly, changes in the position of women. Women are more able to get divorced now because they have more independence, more power and more freedom than in the past. So each of these are in your pack and they have been explained for you. Your task is then to analyse the explanation by explaining how it has led to increased divorce and then provide evidence for this. So I'm giving you some evidence as well on the next few slides. So changes in the law. There has been a spike in the amount of divorces following the Divorce Reform Act, and the divorce rate has increased as divorce laws have relaxed. So you need to explain how changes in the law have, I'm going to help you with this one, have made divorce easier, and therefore that has led to an increase in divorces, and the evidence for that is that there's been a spike following these different divorce laws, and a steady increase as well as the laws have made divorce easier. Decline in stigma. So you need to explain how a decline in the stigma attached to a divorce has led to more divorces, and then you need to illustrate that with some evidence. So I've given you a couple of articles there, which again I will send to you separately so you can click on the link. So look back to your email. And I'd like you to make some notes from them on a separate piece of paper. And then you can also use this as your sort of evidence, the evidence that you put in your pack, which is that there has been a rise in older people getting divorced, which could be due to the removal of a stigma that they may have faced when they were younger. So these articles are really interesting because they're about this trend in something called silver splitters, as in silver hair, grey hair, people splitting up. So silver splitters, there's been an increase in these people, and it could be argued that that's because they got married in a time where they were bound by expectation and felt that they had to in modern society. But as they've got older, they've realised that marriage to their partner is not what they want. And therefore, now that they live in a society where there isn't as much stigma, they have been able to get divorced when they're much, much older. So these are people sort of over 65 that are getting divorced. So very interesting. Secularisation has also played a role, explained in your pack. You need to analyse it, and explain how that's led to more divorces. So this is a bit of evidence for you. This is data from 2011 to 2012, which shows that 60% of marriages take place in approved premises like hotels, stately homes and historic buildings rather than religious buildings. So this shows that marriage isn't seen so much as like a religious ritual anymore, and therefore perhaps that's why people are more happy to get divorced. Also, you can see some differences around the UK. So Wales had the highest proportion of adult population divorced, while Northern Ireland had the lowest. And the reason that's relevant is because there has been secularisation in most of the UK, but Northern Ireland is still very religious, and therefore divorce is much less common in Ireland because of this, because secularisation hasn't occurred there. But it does show that secularisation may have had an impact on the other areas of the country, because there's a correlation between secularisation occurring and an increase in divorce. Rising expectations of marriage then. Bit of evidence for you is that 75% of divorcees go on to remarry someone else. So this is telling us that it's not that they have that they sort of reject the idea of marriage. It's that they weren't happy in their previous one. It didn't meet their high expectations, but they still look for marriage to somebody else in order to get that high standard of marriage that they desire. This suggests that they have not given up on marriage, just that they are not willing to accept an unhappy marriage, and so they divorce in the hope of finding a happier one. The changing position of women, very, very important one that has affected divorce rates. So this data is based on divorces, as it says at the top here, divorces of opposite sex couples. So it doesn't take into account same-sex couples, but when we're thinking specifically about the changing position of women, the kind of main issue that we need to, the main type of marriage, I suppose, that we need to consider in terms of the power dynamics is relationships and power relationships between men and women. So you can see here that this data, as it says in the PowerPoint, this data from the Office for National Statistics shows that women are more likely to file for and be granted a divorce. This trend has occurred since 1979, and it's worth noting that the 70s were a time when women were gaining rights in employment such as equal pay. So the 70s, late 60s to 70s is what's known as the second wave of feminism. First wave is the suffragettes, second wave is kind of fighting for equal rights in employment, mostly based on that, and also in terms of things like contraception and choice over women's bodies and that kind of thing. So if you have a look at this chart table with me, if we have a look at 2014, you can see that more women applied for a divorce in comparison to men. The husbands were granted 41,000 divorces, whereas wives were granted much, much more, 69,000. And that trend continues even as you go up the graph. So 2015, women were granted 62,000, men were granted 38. 2016, women granted 65,000, men granted 41, and so on. Women are more likely to get granted divorces than men. So this tells us that women are now having have now got the independence and the power to decide to split from their partner and to have a life independent of their partner. This is just the gap, the data that goes back even earlier. So back in 1979, about 10 years after the Divorce Reform Act, where women were able to apply for divorces, the wife, as you can see at the bottom here, wives were granted 95,000 divorces compared to 41,000, so the gap used to be even bigger. And then it gets even bigger, even further. This is, I think, the biggest. So yeah, 41 in comparison to 104,000. So women tend to get divorced, tend to file for divorces more than men. And we could say that this is because women have now got more independence. Okay, we've also got then sociological theories and their different explanations. So I'd like you to have a read through the different sociological theories and their views on divorce on page 96. Now, you can probably guess what many of them are likely to say based on your knowledge of the theories. So if you'd like to challenge yourself a little bit, grab a separate piece of paper and write down the theories: functionalism, Marxism, new right, feminism, and see if you can write a sentence to sort of, postmodernism as well, to sort of have a guess at what each of the theories might say about divorce, whether it's good or bad and why. And then you can check it when you read through the different sociological theories on page 96. Within that, there's an application question about women. And then on separate paper, I'd like to test yourself again, have a go at summarising each theory in no more than 2 sentences. And then after that, you can think about which one do you most agree with and write a short paragraph to explain why you agree with them, what it is that you agree with about their theory. Okay, and that brings us to the end of this topic of divorce. We will be starting next lesson with a bit of a recap and consolidation of the stuff you've learned today. Please do email me if you have any questions at all, and I will make sure that I answer them. And yeah, I hope this was okay. Thanks very much. Enjoy, and I'll speak to you soon.